This hour-long webinar is presented by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, or NCAT, a nonprofit organization with offices across the United States. NCAT works in the areas of sustainable energy, sustainable communities, and sustainable agriculture. My name is Jeff Berkby. I'm Outreach Director for one of NCAT's major programs, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, also known as ATRA. NCAT has managed ATRA for more than 20 years with funding provided by the United States Department of Agriculture. Through ATRA, we provide extensive information on how to farm more sustainably, including information on crops, livestock, organic certification, farm energy, and many other topics. You can visit our ATRA website at www.atra.ncat.org. I want to mention we're grateful to the USDA's Rural Business Cooperative Services for financial support for these webinars. A bit about our Organic Small Grains webinar today. You probably know that using organic farming techniques when raising small grains can cut input costs, and that the organic premium for high quality grains can be as high as 75% above the conventional market. But challenges in organic production exist and can include overdependence on tillage, proper nutrient management, and rotation development. Today's webinar will cover many of these topics, including the economics and marketing of crops, the importance of soil health and minimal tillage, fertility management and acceptable organic nutrient sources, weed and pest management, transition tips to organic, and crop rotation design. During today's hour-long webinar, you'll be able to type in questions in the box on the side of your computer screen. We'll review these questions during the hour and then try to get through as many as possible with our hosts during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. One note also, if you miss anything, a phone number or a certain point during the webinar, keep in mind that the entire presentation will be archived on our ATRA website after the presentation. So you'll be able to watch and listen to the webinar within a day or two at your leisure. Now on to our webinar on making organic small grains work on your farm. The presenters for this webinar are NCAT Field Crop Specialist Susan Tallman and North Dakota organic farmer Dwayne Boehm. Susan Tallman has extensive experience working with farmers, both as a grain buyer for the Great Harvest Bread Company and as an organic farmer recruiter for a private grain merchandiser. Susan grew up on a dryland wheat farm on a fourth-generation farm in eastern Montana and graduated from Cornell University with a bachelor's degree in agronomy. She is also a candidate for Certified Crop Advisor licensure with the American Society of Agronomists. Our other presenter, Dwayne Boehm, raises organic small grains and grass-fed beef on 4,000 acres near Richardson, North Dakota. Dwayne's crops have been organic since 1986. His crops include organic wheat, oats, rye, buckwheat, barley, and hay and forage. Of Dwayne's 4,000 acres, about 1,000 acres are in organic grains. And over the past 20 years, Dwayne has grown his farm business from low to high profitability by going organic. With that intro, Susan, I'll turn it over to you to kick off the webinar.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm broadcasting today from the NCAT office in Butte, Montana, and Dwayne Boehm is with us from the North Dakota State University Dickinson Research and Extension Center in Dickinson, North Dakota. So thanks so much to all the staff there in Dickinson and in Butte who have helped to make this happen. And thanks too to you, Dwayne. You drove into town today to be with us. So Jeff gave us a good overview of what we're going to cover, so I'm going to dive right in. First of all, what is organic? Well, there's a federal working definition of this, but for our purposes today, let's say that organic farming is the act of producing food without the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, sewage sludge, and without the use of genetically modified seeds or products. Now, to get this certification, you need to follow these practices for 3 years prior to the first organic harvest and have a third-party certifier verify your production methods. In the interest of time, we're not going to cover the certification process today. However, there are several resources that can help you develop your Organic Systems Plan, or OSP, for certification. And the first one I want to point out is the NCAT Organic Crops Workbook. This is an 80-page guide that can talk you through the steps of developing an organic systems plan for crop production. And you can access this document on our website, or you can order a hard copy at our toll-free number. The next resource for certification is the New Farm website at the Rodale Institute. They have a web course that will talk you through the certification plan and also some OSPs there for you to look at online. The OMRI Standards Manual is another great reference. This has all the allowable practices, the allowable materials that you can use, and it also has a list of the complete federal organic regulations. If you are looking for a certifier, the USDA website has a great reference there. If you click on the National Organic Program and then click Certifiers, you should be able to find a certifier in your location. Also, another certification resource is your local state Department of Agriculture. The USDA has been sponsoring an organic cost share program for people transitioning to organic, and that helps offset up to $750 of the cost of certification, and they do that through the state Departments of Agriculture. So you might want to check there and see what you can find out. And if you're interested in reading the entire federal standards and guidelines for organic production, you can access them at the website I have listed here. Okay, another definition that I'm just going to throw out here at the beginning is, what is a small grain? Sometimes that can be a confusing thing that people don't know what that is. Basically, those are the cool season grasses, and wheat is usually at the top of that list. Barley, oats, rye, triticale, some specialty grains, spelt and kamut are some of those specialty grains, and then buckwheat. Buckwheat isn't technically a small grain because it's a broadleaf crop, but it usually gets included in that group because it's oftentimes included in the rotations. Where are these small grains grown? Well, the organic small grains are typically grown in the same regions that the conventional small grains are grown, usually in the Great Plains states. Montana leads organic small grain production with over 61,000 acres, and Kansas, North Dakota, Colorado, Minnesota round out the top of that list. This is information from a 2005 survey done by USDA, and you can access that survey there at the website listed. Notice that in the United States total, we have over 386,000 acres devoted to organic small grain production. However, this is only about 0.5 to 1% of the total small grain production out there. So while the production of organic small grains is limited, the consumer demand for organic products has been steady and rising for the past 20 years. The Organic Trade Association has a great website at www.ota.com, and they describe some of these trends. In general, the demand for organic products has increased by about 20% every year since 1997. Right now, retail organic food sales represent over $22 billion, which is about 3.5% of the total food sales in the United States. So there are some opportunities in this market for producers. Historically, there have been good premiums given to producers for growing organic grains. Of course, no one has a crystal ball to predict the future and to know what those prices will do, but I think it's safe to say that there are some established markets out there as well as a growing consumer demand. So, this leads us to the topic of marketing and budgets, which some people might think is a strange place to start for a talk on production agriculture, but really this is where we need to start. Before we plant any seed in the ground, we need to know, how are we going to market this crop? So there's a couple of points I want to bring up here, and the first is, it's really important for you to know your production costs and get a handle on your enterprise budgets. So the Montana Department of Agriculture has a great website that I've listed here, and they've put together some enterprise budgets for different organic rotations, for small grain organic rotations. You can find it on the website there. In addition, the University of Minnesota has a great resource. They have a 2008 Organic Farm Performance Report, and Dwayne has mentioned that this has been very helpful to him. And this lists actual enterprise budgets of actual organic farms. Dwayne has also said that the North Dakota State University Farm Management Program has been helpful to him. This does not geared only for organic, but for all farmers in North Dakota. In general, it just helps with your income statement and balance sheet. Knowing what your variable costs are, knowing what your per acre costs will really help you guide some of the decisions as you move into organic. Planning for the transition period is important. You may see a bit of a yield drop. Some people don't see a yield drop and some people do. Also, during that transition period, you won't be able to get any organic premiums on that crop, so you need to be aware of that. Later on, Dwayne's going to talk about some of his transition strategies, and we can touch on that a little bit more. And then, of course, you need to ask yourself, where am I going to sell this stuff? You need to research potential buyers. This is a different area than conventional farming, where you could at harvest time maybe just drive the truck into town and deposit that grain right at the local elevator and be done with it. Organics is different. You need to be building some relationships with buyers. So to do that, there's a couple of resources I've listed. Again, the Organic Trade Association has a good reference here. The Organic Pages Online, they have a Find a Buyer section where you can go and search by what you're wanting to sell. Now, this list is not exhaustive, but it's a good place to start. Also, the O-Farm organization is a cooperative that helps farmers market their products, their organic products, and that might also be a good resource to check out. I think it goes without saying that you need to be in tune with the market and grow what the market wants. It might be fun to grow a very unique specialty grain and put it in the bin, but the last thing you want to do is grow it, put it in the bin, and then go start searching for a buyer. You want to make sure that you've kind of talked with buyers before you go to planting, so you know what they want. Are they looking for malt barley for a microbrewery, or are they looking for a soft wheat for a pretzel manufacturer? So you need to have your finger on the pulse of the market, probably much more so than a conventional farmer. I think it's also important that you understand what grows in your region. I get this question from time to time, people who are maybe looking at doing a really small plot of grain and wondering if they can perhaps grow grain for their local pasta manufacturer or something like that. And be aware, particularly with wheat, so much of the quality of wheat really depends on the region that it's grown in. So North Dakota, for example, is just a prime location for growing durum wheat for pasta. So if you're in upstate New York and you want to start up a little pasta business and grow your own grain there, you might not have that great of luck. So be aware that these different regions will influence what you can grow. A couple other points on marketing that I'd like to mention. If you're contracting, make sure you get your agreement in writing. And also have a plan B. So much of selling your small grains depends on their quality, and with wheat, protein really is the king of that quality. So what happens if your contract is asking for 14% hard red spring wheat and what you can deliver is 13.2? Will they still take it? Will they dock it? If so, by how much? Or is there another end use that you can market that wheat for? Make sure that you're thinking about some multi-use strategies. You might also want to consider some non-traditional channels. We've especially heard of this if you're growing for on a small scale. We've heard of some people out there who are doing community-supported agriculture models for grains, growing a small bit of grain and then delivering it to local customers. Generally, when we grow grains, we're growing quite a bit of it, so that doesn't really work for everybody, but you kind of need to think of some of those strategies as well. Understanding historical trends is important. There is some information out there now. The USDA is starting to collect organic grain marketing information, and you can access that at this site here. There is some historical data there. It doesn't go back a huge amount of time, but it is there. So you might be interested in that. And I believe that information is compiled in Des Moines, Iowa. Another great reference is the Montana Department of Agriculture for folks who are in Montana. I do want to stress, however, that this is local information and it's crop specific. So here I'm showing a chart of Montana organic spring wheat historical trends, and this is from the years 2000 to 2008. Essentially, you might even want to cut that off at 2007 because, as we all know, we saw a huge spike in the markets around 2007, 2008, and that's reflected here. So if you wanted to kind of cut it off at about Q1 2007, it might give you a more realistic picture of what's going on there. But you can see here the yellow trend line at the bottom is showing the conventional hard red spring wheat, and I believe they were calculating that as a cash market price. And then the green trend line there is the organic hard red spring wheat. I believe this was assumed at a 14% protein level as well. And then you can see the blue line above shows the organic premium as a percentage of the conventional price. Notice that the organic price does kind of parallel or trend with the conventional price, but in general it seems to be a little bit more steady than the conventional markets. They're not quite as volatile. Likewise, I have a trend here of winter wheat historical trends. Again, this is in Montana, and this is with winter wheat. So be aware that there is some information out there. I think Montana, being the top organic small grain producing state, has probably gathered more information than other locations that I'm aware of, but there are some states who have this information available. Okay, we've talked about marketing. We can move on to agronomy and crop production. Once you've thought about your marketing goals and who's going to buy that great stuff that you're producing, how are you actually going to grow it? So I'd like to start off talking about the organic crop rotation standard that's actually in the federal guidelines. And those state that the producer needs to implement a rotation that has some sod, cover crops, or green manure crops and catch crops, and those need to function to maintain or improve the soil organic matter content. That's very important. It also needs to provide for pest management in their crops, manage deficient or excess plant nutrients, and provide erosion control. But right now I want to focus on that maintaining or improving soil organic matter content. This is tricky, and this is one of the challenges of an organic small grain system. Because organic small grains, we rely so much on tillage for weed control, maintaining our organic matter levels and making sure that we don't have soil erosion is probably one of the big challenges to organic farming. So let's talk a little bit about soil health and organic matter. How can we increase our organic matter levels, or how can we stop organic matter from leaving? Well, there's a couple of strategies we can use. The first one is adding materials from off the field, such as manures or compost. That's a great way to get more organic matter to your soil. Also, better utilizing your crop residue. In most cases, you don't want to be baling that straw and taking it off the field. You want to be making sure that it's going out the back of the combine and getting an even distribution so you get even microbial degradation. You don't want to leave that in a windrow. Including high residue producing crops in your rotation is another great way. Traditionally, the oil seeds are known for not having great residue. So if you have an oil seed in your rotation, maybe you want to follow that with a triticale or a rye, which has high residue. Including sod crops in your rotation is very, very important. Notice this is the first practice on this chart that actually helps us decrease the losses from the system. So if you're rotating in grains, you might want to consider having a 5-year pasture rotation in there, or some alfalfa or something like that that's going to help hold the soil and help you increase your organic matter. Growing cover crops is another strategy. I know that especially in the humid areas of the country that growing cereal rye is a popular strategy for getting some organic matter into the soil, and they terminate that before it heads out so they can get some good organic matter. And reducing your tillage intensity. This is very important for organics. Make sure that you just don't till just because the calendar says so. Wait for that first flush of weeds and make sure that they've all come up and germinated nicely before you get out there and till. Try not to disc too much. Disking can really pulverize the soil. Use flat shovels on your chisel plow and till very shallow if you can. And use conservation practices to reduce erosion. You can use buffer strips, wind breaks, shelter belts, things like that to help keep that valuable soil in your fields. There's a great resource out there, Building Better Soils for Better Crops by Magdoff and Van Ness. It's a SARE publication, and you can order that book. It's also available to download online. It's about 250 pages of great information specifically on soil health and organic matter. So because tillage is a concern in an organic system, there's several very smart people out there that are working on devising a no-till organic system. This is kind of the long-term ideal. And I put in a photo here from the Dickinson Research Center that I took this summer. This is a roller crimper, and it's out there in a field of cereal rye. And what they're trying to do here is terminate that cover crop of rye without tilling. So they're trying to add organic matter to their soil with that cover crop, but realizing that tillage is kind of at cross purposes of building organic matter. So there's this implement out there called the roller crimper. So currently there's not a continuous no-till organic small grain system, but work is being done at Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania. And I know that Pat Carr at North Dakota State University in Dickinson, the Dickinson Research Center, is doing some work on this as well. So for those of you out there who are already small grain farmers and like to experiment, this might be something fun for you to experiment with. There's some people out there talking about how can we make this work, and the more people who are working on this, probably the better. With the roller crimper, it's been a challenge to figure out how to make this work perfectly, basically because timing is essential to good termination of the cover crop. Ideally, you want to terminate at the peak of biomass production. Jeff Moyer at Rodale estimates that's about 5,000 pounds per acre, but if you're in a dry region, it may need to be less than that so you can conserve your soil moisture. Ideally, the grasses should be terminated at pollen shed and the broadleaves at flowering. The challenge that people are running into with this is that if you roll too light, the cover crop bounces back. So I had the opportunity to tour a farm in Bismarck, North Dakota this summer, and they had last year, I believe, experimented with the cover crop of an oat-pea mixture, and they took the roller crimper over it, and the peas terminated beautifully, but the oats bounced right back. So they were scratching their heads over what to do on that one. Alternately, on the other hand, if you roll too hard, you're going to break that stem, and the plant will regrow from the break. So you have to roll just at the right time with just the right amount of pressure on a particular species of cover crop to make this work. And you can imagine that's a challenge for these researchers. So if this is something you're interested, Rodale would be an excellent contact, or Dr. Carr at the Dickinson Research Extension Center. Okay, well, we've talked about soil health. Let's talk a little bit about nutrient management. This is another very important part of the piece for organic production. I think one of the things I really want to stress here is that you have to understand the concept of a nutrient budget. So harvested nutrients are removed from the system and they must be replaced for long-term sustainability. So if you see there, I just put in this photo of the combine. What's really happening here is that plant grew from the nutrients in the soil, and now that grain part of the plant is being loaded into the truck and taken out of the system. So in essence, you could say that this photo represents exported nutrients from the field. Now, of all the 16 essential nutrients, nitrogen is the only one we can grow. So all others need to be applied as some type of fertilizer. Well, how are we going to do that? There's certain allowable practices in organics and some that aren't. The Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI, does keep a list of allowable organic substances. I'd recommend you get a copy of some of their manuals, or you can also search their database online. But let's go ahead and talk about those top three nutrients that we all hear about all the time, N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and talk about some potential and realistic sources for those nutrients in an organic small grain system. The first is green manure legumes, and these are nature's little miracle plant, peas, clovers, alfalfa, things like that, where they are fixing nitrogen from the air, and the plant uses that for its growth. Also, organic matter can be a source of nitrogen. This would come most likely in the form of compost, which gives a great slow-release nitrogen benefit to the soil. The hard thing, though, is if you're growing small grains on an extensive land base, let's say 1,000 acres, it's not too realistic that you'd have enough compost for 1,000 acres. Next is animal manure, and again, this is an excellent source of nitrogen for your fertility in your fields. Let's talk about green manure because there's a lot of questions surrounding green manures. The difficulty with green manures that people find is that they can be variable in their nitrogen addition, and this is particularly pertinent for folks who are in dry regions. So in a dry region, if your nitrogen production is tied to rainfall, we all know, if we're from a dry region, how sometimes unpredictable that can be. So I threw in a chart here. This is from the University of Manitoba, and they are showing the nitrogen production value from two different sites, one in Winnipeg and one in Carmen, and with 4 different species of green manures: alfalfa, red clover, chickling vetch, and black lentil. And you can see that those nitrogen amounts, and this is in pounds per acre of nitrogen to the soil, are quite variable with species and with location. And you can see there's even one place where the red clover took nitrogen out of the soil. So my point here is not to scare you away from green manures, but my point here is you really need to know the local green manures used in your area. You really need to talk to other farmers about what do they use. You can see here, if you were a farmer in Carmen and you used chickling vetch, you'd get a great result as compared with alfalfa, but it was the opposite in Winnipeg. So I think that would be an important point to make, that before you design your rotation, before you pick a green manure out of a book, don't do that. Make sure that you're talking to farmers in your area about what they use. The general estimation is that annual legumes have about 3.5 to 4% of their dry matter is nitrogen. So when you plow that down, that's about what you're going to get. So generally, not always, but generally, the more biomass you're producing, the more nitrogen you have. And a lot of the crop scientists here in Montana are estimating that an average winter pea green manure crop gives about 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But, you know, as we know, that can be variable from one year to the next. So that's just kind of a ballpark. Also, we need to really keep in mind the timing of the termination, especially for those of us in dry regions. We estimate here that you should terminate your cover crop around first bloom and no later than mid-bloom. And the reason for that, here in Montana, one of the big issues that we deal with is soil moisture. If we get 10 to 14 inches of rain a year, we're doing really well. So we have to be able to grow a crop the next year. If we let that green manure grow any longer than that, it means that our grain crop the next year doesn't have enough water, and that can be a very major yield limiting factor. Okay, so we touched a little bit on nitrogen. Let's talk a little bit about phosphorus and potassium. What we're seeing here in the northern Great Plains is that often phosphorus is the most limiting nutrient in a small grain system. So we can grow our own nitrogen, we can apply manures, things like that, but when it comes down to it, phosphorus is becoming an issue. So there are some organic sources of phosphorus out there. Animal manure, I put that at the top. Really, that's the best source. It's the most available as far as phosphorus efficiency in the soil. It adds some organic matter back to the soil. And what this is really indicating to me that long-term livestock needs to be a key component of an organic system. There are some other materials out there, rock phosphate and bone meal in particular, but these have a very low availability rate, and when you calculate the amount needed for an application, they can become quite expensive. So really, in the long term, I think what we're going to need to see in some of these systems is some type of livestock or manure link for continuing fertility. Potassium is the next in the big three elements. And if your rotation includes forages or potatoes, if you have a lot of hay in your rotation that you're taking off, you're not just grazing those cows, but you're taking off a lot of hay, you're going to need to think about potassium because you'll need a little bit more if you've got those crops. There are some organic sources of potassium, again, animal manure. Muriate of potash, which is the potassium chloride. That can also be used, but with restrictions. It is a mined substance of high solubility, so there are some organic restrictions on that. So you'd want to check with your certifier before you use that. Also, potassium sulfate and sulfomag are allowed organic potassium sources. Now, in the interest of time, we're just going to talk about those three. Obviously, there's other nutrients required for good crop production. But before we leave this topic, let's talk a little bit about adjusting pH. For our friends out in the Northeast, particularly, liming is such a big part of what you guys do out there in your acidic soils. Most types of lime are allowed if they're mined and they're not combined with synthetic substances, but I would double check with your certifier before applying lime just to make sure that it will be allowed. Now, for those of us in the Northern Plains area, we see the opposite issue. We have alkaline soils, and elemental sulfur is allowed as an organic addition. However, lowering pH with elemental sulfur is often not realistic. And the reason for that is because our alkaline soils usually have a high level of calcium, and that calcium reacts with the sulfur, and they kind of neutralize each other. So if you have a lot of calcium in your soil, you could be just dumping on sulfur and really not see a change in your pH level. There's another fertility resource I'd like to mention. That's the Oregon State Small Farms Fertilizer Calculator. They have a list there of various organic fertilizers, anything from fish emulsions to kelp meal, things like that that I haven't touched on today. And especially if you're growing on a smaller acreage, those types of fertility inputs may be more realistic for you or more accessible for you. But just to be aware that there is that great resource out there. Okay, well, we've talked about fertility. Let's move on and talk about weed management. And usually this is what everybody wants to talk about first, is weeds. How am I going to control weeds? And I have a personal story to share regarding this. My first encounter with organic small grain production was in 1996. I was invited to come and tour a group of organic farms in Big Sandy, Montana. And honestly, I went to this trip very, very skeptical. What I expected to see was fields just full of weeds. I really didn't know what to expect. And I got up there and I saw these beautiful, productive fields, and you could never tell by looking at them that they were organic. They weren't full of weeds. They were very clean and something that any farmer would be very proud of. But usually this is the first question that any conventional farmer wants to talk about. How do I control the weeds if I'm going organic? So I put in this photo. This is a photo of some organic winter wheat that I was able to tour this summer. And it's a very nice, clean-looking field of weed-free wheat. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, let's do a little contrasting here. In a conventional system, we have the big hammer, and that big hammer is herbicide. And we're knocking out those weed plants in the seedling stage by using that one tool that we have. But when we take that one tool away, in an organic system, we have to get creative, and we need to use many little hammers. So instead of using just one main strategy, we need to use strategies at all different points of the growing season. And that's going to include tillage, sanitation, crop density, using cover crops, all sorts of different things. So keep that in mind as we talk about weeds. This isn't a one-size-fits-all. This is trying to use multiple strategies to control your weeds. So a couple of hammers in your toolbox. The first is scouting and inventory. And this is very, very important. You don't want to let a weed problem get out of control in an organic system. So you really need to know the species that you're dealing with. You need to understand their growth cycle. Are they grasses? Are they broadleaves? Are they creeping perennials? Things like that. You need to even make a map of your fields and know what's going on there. Because really in an organic system, prevention is the best cure. You don't want something to get out of control. Our next big hammer in the toolbox is tillage. We've talked a little bit about this, but for most farmers, at least in this region, that means using a chisel plow for their summer fallow and getting in there when they see a flush of weeds. Next is variety selection. This is important. You want to find varieties that come up very quickly and canopy as soon as possible. And there has been some talk out there that perhaps older varieties are better than the modern varieties, but I know that Pat Carr at North Dakota State did a study on this recently and showed that the modern varieties actually did best in the trials that they did for organics. If you're in Washington State or Nebraska, I do know that they're starting to do some wheat breeding specifically for organic systems. So if you're in those two states, check out what they're doing in regard to doing some variety trials there. Seeding density is important. Here in Montana, organic farmers generally plant about 20% more than their conventional counterparts. So let's say 60 pounds per acre is a conventional seeding rate. Some of these guys might go 80 pounds per acre. Row spacing is also important. We see a lot of folks bringing those drill shovels closer together than their conventional counterparts. And again, it's kind of utilizing the same strategy, trying to get an early canopy cover to outcompete those young weed seedlings. Seed size has been found to be important. There's a researcher in the northwestern part of Montana, Dr. Staugard, who's found that seed size plays a role in outcompeting the weeds. And in general, he's found that the plumper seeds give better competition with the wild oats. So it might even be worth grading out your seeds to get the biggest ones that will be the most competitive in the field. Flaming is another strategy for weed control. I think there's been some work done at the University of Nebraska doing some in-crop flaming, but they're not quite ready to release any guidelines. I don't know if they've had a lot of luck with that. But certainly spot flaming could be a method of control, especially for something like Canada thistle that's not going to respond to tillage. If you got out there with a portable flamer when those thistles are about 3 to 4 inches tall, and you could really knock those back significantly. So keep that in mind as a possibility. Rotation is another hammer in your weed control toolbox. In general, the weeds that you see in the field are going to mimic the crop type. So cheatgrass is very typical. It's a winter annual. It loves to be in winter wheat. So you can break up the cheatgrass cycle by planting a spring seeded crop and get in an extra tillage pass before seeding in the spring. Again, rotating between grasses and broadleaves, winter seeded crops and spring seeded crops will really help to break up the disease and weed cycle. Haying is another possibility. If you are finding that you're just coming up with too many weeds, you might need to just not take a grain crop that year and just hay it off before those weeds go to seed. There's a farmer in northern Montana who did this as their strategy for their first crop. They planted spring wheat and found that they were getting too many wild oats that year. So while those oats were in the boot, before they had a chance to go to seed, they just went through and hayed that crop off. So that really took the oat problem down. Also, I've heard the same story from folks who've had alfalfa, that they see less weed problems in those fields after they've done quite a bit of haying. Grazing is another strategy. I've heard of several farmers who turn their cows or sheep onto their fallow ground to keep the weeds down, and that seems to be fairly effective. Sanitation is often an overlooked topic when it comes to weed control. If you're tilling from one field to the next and you lift up your toolbar and you notice you're dragging some bindweed rhizomes, get off and get out of your tractor and take those rhizomes off and put them in the cab and bring them home and burn them or something, but don't drag them from one field to the next. Also, when you're using your combine, if you do have a patch of wild oats in the middle of your field and it's gone to seed and you're driving down the middle of your strip at harvest, stop right there and combine around that patch. If you go through it, those the baby spankers on the back are just going to distribute that wild oat seed far and wide. Just let it be where it is. In extreme cases, you can isolate specific fields and treat them differently than you would an organic field. You do need to have buffer zones for this to happen, and the organic regulations they do not give a specific distance for what a buffer zone should be, so you'll need to talk to your certifier about that. Before we leave weeds, I want to talk about creeping perennials because this can be a real problem. Specifically in our area, we see Canada thistle and field bindweed would be serious problems. There are some strategies that exist for Canada thistle, and we've talked about those a little bit. Planting alfalfa seems to work really well because it competes with the Canada thistle. It competes with it for water and seems to smother it. Haying also works really well if you're haying that alfalfa, spot flaming and grazing. But there's really not as many strategies for bindweed, so early detection is very important. There is an organic farmer here in Montana who left organic farming because he got a very large bindweed problem in his field. So just as a word of caution, make sure that you are monitoring your fields for anything that looks remotely like these weeds. All right, let's move on a little bit and talk briefly on disease. I only put one slide in here on disease, but we do need to talk about it. Basically, if you're using a varied rotation, that's really going to help a lot in controlling disease in your field. And using certified seed is also going to help, and resistant varieties too. There's so many varieties out there that are now resistant to diseases, but you kind of have to select your variety. You know, you're looking for a variety that canopies quickly, you're looking for a variety that is resistant to diseases, and of course, no one variety is resistant to every disease out there, so you'll need to prioritize which diseases are the most important in your area. Another thing to talk about in regard to disease is seed-borne diseases. In conventional farming, I think we're all used to seeing the seeds that go into the drill and they're bright pink because we put fungicide on them. But in an organic system, these are not allowed. So diseases such as smut and bunt, we need to think about some more organic alternatives for these diseases. In Canada and Europe, they do a little bit better job of prioritizing their variety resistance so that they have resistant varieties to smut and bunt, but in the United States, with the advent of conventional fungicides, that really hasn't been a priority for us. There are some techniques that you can use, of course using good clean seed, even washing in hot water, some things like that that can be used. But in general, I would say that that's a topic that we need to think a little bit more on in organics. Insect management, I threw in one slide here. We've got a photo of that nasty little lesser grain borer up there. And insect management, I don't want to talk so much about in-crop insect management as I want to talk about storage insect management. If you're marketing your organic grains, some of those grains might take up to a year to sell from harvest. So having clean, good storage is going to be very important. You need to keep that storage dry and cool, especially if marketing is a challenge. And I think it might be one of the reasons that we see more organic production here in Montana and North Dakota is because we're in one of the cool climates where we have less pest pressure than some of the other areas of the country. There are some strategies for using diatomaceous earth in bins, and in some upcoming publications that we're going to be putting out, we detail how you can use diatomaceous earth for storage. Also, bringing in the cool night air will be important. Again, in Montana and North Dakota, by the time we hit harvest, those nighttime temperatures are already getting down to maybe 50 or 60 degrees. But if you're in somewhere like Kansas or Oklahoma, that may not be the case. So you'll want to put some fans in the bin and just bring in that cool night air to help bring the temperature down, and it'll really minimize the possibility of insect infestation or mold infestation. All right, let's talk a little bit about transition. This is a question that people often ask as well. How do I transition? I just wanted to put this slide in here that was given to me by Dr. Bruce Maxwell at Montana State University, talking about that transition time. And oftentimes people ask, will I see a yield drop? That's a tough question to answer because every farm is so different. There are many organic farmers who say they haven't seen a yield drop, some who say they have. And of course, over time, that's a question too. How long have they been farming? Are they new to organics? Have they been doing this 10 years? So there's some big questions there. In general, I like to tell people that they'll see a yield drop just so they can prepare for that, and then if it doesn't happen, so much the better. And over here we kind of have just a picture of what might happen with your buffers. Buffers being those natural processes that help to minimize any risks in your system, and that would be things such as beneficial insects or beneficial fungi, things like that that are actually helping your crop production. So in general, when you're in a high input system, you're using lots of inputs, you have fewer buffer mechanisms because let's say you're using an insecticide, that insecticide is killing the bad bugs, but it's killing the good bugs as well. As you transition to a low input system, you're asking for more reliance on natural processes, and that's bringing more buffers into the system. So it can take a couple of years for a system to get used to that, and generally the higher your inputs have been, the more that transition time can be. Now, not everybody sees that, and it's hard for me to give an exact recipe or indication of how long that would take for each farm, but I do want you to be aware of it. In general, I would recommend that people transition in stages. If you have 1,000 acres of small grains, don't do 1,000 acres all at once. Maybe do 200 acres a year. You don't want to do it too slow because if it takes 10 years, it'll just drag it out and make the record keeping very, very difficult. But if you do it too quickly, it might be too much all at once. Also, plan for your cash flow. During that transition, there are no price premiums. You need to be aware of that. And we did talk about the yield question a little bit. It's not universal, but you should plan for a yield drop. Your yields will likely return to what they were prior to the transition, but it's hard to get some definite scientific numbers on that. I know that in Iowa, Kathleen Dellett has done some great work in a long-term organic rotation, and she finds that in corn and soybeans, she gets about 90 to 95% of the same yields as the conventional trials. But that's corn and soybeans. So we don't have a lot of great long-term yield data comparing conventional and organic. So I don't want to give numbers for that, but probably your best bet is to talk to local organic farmers in your area to see what's going on with them. So let's talk a little bit about rotation design. This can be really confusing. You're thinking, okay, I have to do organic matter and weeds and disease and all this stuff, and it's just too confusing. I don't want to be bothered, but I would encourage you, don't give up in this process. This is where the fun is. This is where it's challenging, but it's also very, very rewarding to figure out, how am I going to make this work on my farm? The biggest thing I can say is you really need to talk to other farmers in your area. How do they do this? Go on tours. Make friends with people who are doing this. In our area, the Montana Organic Association is a great resource for that. We just had our annual convention here, and that was a great time to get together and talk about these things. In the Dakotas, the Northern Plains Sustainable Ag Society is a great resource. But when you're designing your rotation, there's a couple of things you need to think about. in our area, the dry areas, the first thing that we have to think about is water use. So we can't be growing crops that are using too much of the soil water, because then we can't grow crops the next year. So how often do we need to fallow our ground is really a big question for us here. Fertility is the next question. How are we going to make sure that as we're growing these grains and exporting them off the farm that we're replenishing the soil? Diversity is very key. We talked about that with broadleafs and grasses, spring seeded and winter seeded. I think livestock is a very key component to any organic system, and long term we're going to see more of this, I think. The question is, how can I get a livestock component into my system? Maybe it's not you necessarily, but maybe you could partner with the feedlot that's down the road and see if they have some excess manure. Reducing your tillage will be important. How can you get some sod crops into your rotation to build the soil? And then you need to think about equipment. You know, if you've just been doing winter wheat in your conventional rotation, if you're going to try and do some alfalfa now, well, you might need to get a swather and a baler. How's that going to work out and play out for you? Just as an example, I'm going to throw in a northern Montana rotation. This is from a farm I was able to tour this past summer. These folks get 10 to 14 inches in annual precipitation, and they do a rotation of spring wheat, summer fallow, winter wheat, and then a spring pea green manure that's plowed down around the second or third week of June. But of course, it's difficult for me to give a prescription to everyone, and that's not really what you want. You want to do what works for your own farm in your own location. Okay, I have just a couple more slides here, and then we're going to bring Dwayne in to talk about his farm. I listed a couple of reasons you want to consider organic grain production. And the first one I put up there is that you must innovate and experiment on your own farm. This can be a rewarding challenge. There's several farmers out there who say, this put the fun back into farming for me. And I can believe it, because if you go to their farms, there's just all sorts of diversity on their farm. You don't see monoculture at all. So this becomes a real fun challenge for a lot of people. Another reason is that organic production uses no pesticides. This is better for the ecosystem and human health, and it gives the farmer greater freedom from the rising costs of inputs. That, of course, is something that really affects the bottom line. Oftentimes we see that organic production is greater than conventional in a drought year because there's more organic matter in that soil, and this is comparing conventional tillage system, not a no-till system. And also you might be eligible for some EQIP funds. NRCS now has an EQIP organic program to help offset any conversion costs. You do need to show, however, that it's actually conserving natural resources. Just because it's organic doesn't mean that you can qualify for these funds. You do need to show that there's a conservation effort there. A couple more reasons to consider the production of organic grains is that it requires increased crop diversity, which spreads out your income source, helps to break pest cycles. Also, most farmers in the organic community are friendly and willing to share advice. We talked about this as well, but the less input costs means better health to your bottom line, and a lot of farmers are now saying that they don't need to apply for an annual operating loan. Per acre returns can be the same or better than conventional farming. The yields are favorable and the input costs are decreased, so that comes out to better for the bottom line. Historically, we've seen the demand for organic grains has been strong and rising. And for the high quality hard red spring wheat, we're seeing 75 to 100% price premiums for those high quality grains. Now, of course, as with any on the one hand, there's also on the other hand. So a couple of reasons to think twice about organic grain production. This may not be for you. And the first reason is just like the one on the other hand, is that you must innovate and experiment on your farm. For some people, this is a huge source of frustration. They just want someone to tell them what to do so they can focus their efforts on other things. So if you're not willing to take that time and figure out your rotation, talk to other farmers, see what works, develop your marketing systems, all that, this might not be for you. Also, nutrient management is not as prescriptive as conventional production. In a conventional system, we almost have a recipe. You know, if you add X and Y, that will equal Z. But especially with the variability of green manure legumes, that can be different. So be aware of that. Also, most large grain farms that I visit, they don't have easy access to large amounts of animal manure. And over time, that's going to be a key component of building your soil fertility. So on a smaller scale, that seems to be a little bit easier adding the livestock in, but that can be a challenge for those large grain farmers out there. Be aware that the first 3 to 5 years of transition are the most difficult as the system is adjusting to new management and no price premiums are available. You may see a yield drop, you may not. Talk to other farmers in your area to see what they've experienced. Also, if you don't have other organic farmers in your area to talk to, it can be very difficult to know what steps to take. Those green manures are very specific to each location, knowing what rotations to use, things like that. So joining a local organization is critical to your production survival. Also, tillage is generally the most significant method of weed control in an organic system, but that can defeat the purpose of building soil organic matter, so you really need to be aware of your soil organic matter levels. I would recommend that you're testing those levels about every 5 years because it takes a long time to build soil organic matter. You don't need to test it every year, but you do need to be out there knowing what's going on in your fields as far as organic matter level goes. Currently, we haven't developed a system of continuous no-till organic production. We're working on it, but we're not there yet. And if your fields have extensive problems with creeping perennial weeds such as Canada thistle or field bindweed, you shouldn't consider organic production until they're under control. Also be aware that a cash grain crop cannot be produced on all of your land every year. Because of the rotation requirements, you'll need to have some green manure crops in there or some cover crops, some sod crops perhaps, so you can't assume that every acre of your land will be used for production. Also, if you live in a region with little organic grain production, finding a buyer might be difficult, so be aware that that might take some time and effort on your part. Okay, well that's all I have. Let's get to the real expert now. I'd like to introduce Dwayne Boehm. He and his wife Chantra farm in Richardson, North Dakota, and I had the privilege of visiting their farm this summer to see how they do things. They have 1,000 acres of organic small grains, and they also raise natural beef cattle. So welcome, Dwayne, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. Glad to be with you.
All right. Well, I'd like to just kind of jump in and ask you some questions here. I'm wondering if you could describe your farm operation to us.
Yes, I can. Let me first say that I am a farmer and not a presenter, so I may not always be following the slides in front of you, but certainly will include those items. I guess we view our farm as a low-input, sustainable farm. At least that's our effort. As you can see, we started in 1986, or in 1972, excuse me, and in the mid-'80s we were searching hard for a more profitable way of farming, and settled on organics because of reduced input costs, we felt, and the possibility of some premium prices. As you can see, our precipitation and all the information about our farm there, I would like to highlight the last item on the present slide, and that is income statement. To me, whether it's organic farm or not, certainly has to be profitable in order to be in that business for a long period of time. And so that's why I'd like to emphasize that. I guess we found that organics was in line with our goals, of those being financial security, producing a product that the consumer wants, and reduced reliance on inputs. And of course, as Susan mentioned, I agree with everything Susan said early on, and certainly in our case as well, concern about health and environmental concerns were certainly part of the consideration in transitioning.
Thanks, Dwayne. And as I recall, you were telling me that in the 80s the interest rates were high, and it was really hard for you guys to make ends meet farming the way that you had been.
Correct. We started farming with little or no. We didn't have a cushion, or we didn't have a large financial pool to draw from, so we were operating with borrowed monies, and certainly, finances was a big part of our operation and the concerns about it. I mean, that's why I suppose on an ongoing basis we emphasize the bottom line.
Right, right. Okay, well, thanks. And I know that you had I'll back up a little bit here. I've got some photos here of our trip out to your farm. We've got this gorgeous crop of rye that we saw and some spring wheat, oats and peas. So they have a pretty diverse operation there with their farm. And Dwayne, I'm wondering if you could maybe address some of the issues on transition and how you went about transition and things that have worked for you.
Yes, certainly. In the early time when we transitioned, we did transition all of our owned land at one time. In hindsight, that may not have been a good plan because there is certainly a learning curve that happens. I guess it happens as much or at least speaking for myself. I guess I should say I'm speaking for myself, but my experience was that there's a learning curve or a learning experience in my mind that has to happen as well as on the farm and on the land. Having coming from a conventional system prior, I was aware of tools as Susan has indicated. We could purchase solutions. In an organic system, we attempt to prevent problems rather than purchasing solutions to those problems after we have them. So but just to make that point, in the transition we found, and we have used that several times throughout our experience, we've had an opportunity to purchase some adjoining land as time's gone on. So we've had land in transition pretty much continuous throughout the last 15 to 20 years. And what we found that works well for us is to include, first of course, to determine what the situation is. I mean, what crops presently we were growing, how are they managed? In our case, it was conventional lands that we brought in, so that's the assumption here. And the 36-month rule, depending upon what has happened post-harvest, it's 36 months prior to harvesting an organic crop. So that's the consideration there. So if in fact it may well only be 2 harvest years that we're giving up versus the 3-year, but the 36-month rule, of course, applies. What we've done quite successfully is incorporating the first year we'll plant oat, and we'll use that as a cover crop for a legume. And sweet clover has worked very well in our farm, alfalfa as well. But we like sweet clover because of the biomass. So typically in the first year, go back to the finance part, is we need to generate some income. So we can plant that the first year, and we typically would hay that. And we, in our situation, have non-organic livestock, but certainly you could hay it and sell it to someone as well if you did not have livestock in your operation. So we have the sweet clover growing under this crop of oats that we would hay off, and then we use the hay for livestock feed. The sweet clover would be allowed to grow. In our case, it's a crop that will come back then the next year without having to seed it again. So then the next year we use it as a green manure crop. In our case, we allow it to grow up to the maximum level to increase organic matter, and we like it because it's a slow-release nitrogen. As it breaks down in the soil, we see benefits for several years. So that's our preference. We also use alfalfa sometimes, and that also can be seeded the same way, undersown with a crop, typically oats, but you can seed it under other crops as well. In a transition, we like it because oats makes a good hay crop. And then the next years, of course, the alfalfa could be used as a cash crop in selling the hay, or in our case, we harvest the hay for our livestock. And there too, you could leave it in from possibly 3 to 5 years, depending on your situation, your markets. But we typically would leave that in until we've passed the 36-month time frame for certain, if not longer. And then we would, as we call it, break that out or destroy it, and then grow a cash crop for market for human consumption.
Okay, great. And Dwayne, when you, all these different times that you've transitioned fields, the yield question, did you see a drop in your cash grain yield?
I would say not, maybe slightly, but the key seems to be it's hard to how should I say this? It's hard to talk about one or the other of these events without looking at the big picture. So yields, yes, possibly slightly, but we're working on fertility at the same time so as to not have the yield decrease. So that's where the soil building starts from day one with green manure crops in an effort to not have the yield drop.
Okay, great. Well, let's address a little bit of your rotation, and I know that you kind of view rotation as There's a whole picture there with soil building and weed control. Wonder if you could address that a little bit there for us.
Yes, as you've stated earlier, I believe also that diversity is key to incorporate grass crops, broadleaf crops, early seeded, late seeded, fall seeded crops, and of course crops that will build the soil. I also like, as far as the rotation diversity, as you've noted, is multi-use crops. And what I'm thinking about there is a crop, so as you indicated earlier, if we have a crop that we're intending for harvest for human consumption, and use hard red spring wheat as an example, if we get in a situation, whether it's due to weeds or whether it's due to environmental things out of our control, whether it be drought or hail or those kind of things, to have a multi-use crop, which I consider to be a crop that is useful for more than the original intended use of human consumption for food, and that may well be livestock feed, whether it's hayed or grazed, something like that. And then, of course, the other thing to include, we like varieties, and crops that are fast-growing, lot of residue. We like crops that, of course, like you indicated earlier, to provide an early, quick canopy, to compete with weeds, to shade the soil, preserve moisture for the crop, and also residues, as you indicated again. I'm agreeing with most everything you indicated early on because they're right on target. We want to have a lot of residue because we look at this as a long-term situation versus short-term, and so we know that these cover crops and that these residues from these crops are going to provide nutrients for the soil and the plants on down the road.
Great, great. And I know that you'd also, when you talk about so much of your farm management, it's not just the agronomic management, it's the profit management, and I know that that plays a factor in how you design your rotation. Maybe if you could speak a little bit to rotation and the profit considerations.
Certainly. And some of these you indicated early on as well in your presentation, but insurability, that's certainly a consideration. Depending on your crops that you're going to grow, some are insurable under the federal crop insurance program, some are not. So that's a consideration because we always have to plan for the unknown, which may well be a crop failure for some reason. Whether it's, as I indicated earlier, it might be weather related to drought or hail or some other situation. And then the machinery needs. If we're going to grow a crop that requires machinery that we have never had in the past, or that needs repairs or whatever, so there's some costs involved. Cash flow, marketing, you touched on those, and there too, it's important, I believe, and at least in our experience, to have your lenders, if you're dealing with lenders, and we certainly were on the front end of this, in developing cash flow as to marketing these crops. As you indicated, it's not like a conventional system where you can market when you choose to, but rather when the market needs your product. And many times to get what I would consider a good price, it requires some storage, and cash flow may be an issue as far as timing especially. So they're having the lender be part of your team, if you want to call it that, or certainly being aware of the situation and the changes from a conventional system.
Great, great. I know that as we had talked earlier, you had said that most of your crops you're able to market a year after they harvest, but not always. You said that you sometimes have a hard time getting a good buyer on your rye crop, and that can even take a couple of years. So that's a question that you need to take into consideration too, it sounds like. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the soil building that you do there on your farm. Some of the strategies that you use for that, if you could speak to that, if you will.
Yes. As I've indicated with the rotation, these things all play together, so I try to look at the big picture, if you will, to include all of those things, to include, soil building. And soil building, we attempt to incorporate anything possible into the soil, and that includes green manure crops, crop residues, livestock manure. The majority of our cropland is fenced, so the livestock, the cattle, in our case beef cattle, help to utilize those resources as well as recycle them back onto the land. Typically, whether it's crop residue or cover crops or what it is that they're grazing, of course, they're cycling those nutrients and putting them back on the soil. So that is important, as well as, if it's crop residue, in some cases it may be weeds that we will actually till into the soil to help build the soil prior to going to seed, as you indicated earlier. That's timing is crucial. Livestock manure, we do cover some of our land each year with livestock manure from where we feed livestock in the winter. We are actually attempting to minimize that by feeding out more on our actual land, whether it's hayland, pasture, and in some cases cropland, because we're concerned about pollution, of course, and those kind of things. When we do apply manures, 6 to 8 ton, typically there's no concerns about over applying. So that's typically how we do it. Sometimes there's higher applications in marginal land areas. Tillage there as well. Tillage certainly is a part of our operation. We've kind of gone full circle from I guess you would call conventional or intense tillage to minimum till, and we are presently back to more tillage, primarily because of perennial weeds. As you touched on, perennial weeds are a problem on our farm as well, primarily Canada thistle and field bindweed, and my observation is that tillage is certainly part of that. We try to do timely tillage and not recreational tillage, as some folks just till because we like to be in a tractor on a hot day, but rather when tillage applies.
I'm just getting a chuckle out of your recreational tillage thought there. I want to point out something too, Dwayne, that I was just very impressed with when I visited your farm. You had mentioned that when you started the transition process, your organic matter levels were at 2%, and they're now at about 3%. And I just found that to be very, very impressive because you're dealing with sandy and sandy loam soils, and those coarser soils tend to be harder to raise the organic matter level on. So just want to make sure, did I get that right, that you've gone from about 2 to 3%?
Yes, that is correct. I mean, realizing that, we're doing this primarily, some years back, and it was conventional tillage systems. In a conventional no-till system, that wouldn't be surprising, but we've maintained those levels and improved them. And I believe that's because we've incorporated residues of every kind that we can. And as you indicated, we've chosen not to bale off straws and remove residues, but rather leave them on the land. And I think the livestock is a crucial part of that. We have some land that's not fenced where we do not get livestock on, and we've actually been able to accomplish the same thing, but we may have to include green manure and incorporations of those more often.
Okay, great, great. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the bottom line and the financial health. One of the things that I was impressed with Dwayne and Chantra when I was able to visit is their really savvy business managers. And so, Dwayne, if you could talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you use for managing the financial health of your farm.
Yes, I'd be happy to. And I guess I would also, need to comment that we are a mom and pop operation, myself and my wife Chantra, so it takes everyone involved, and in our case, we're certainly both aware of what we're attempting to do. And yes, finances, a lot of it started not by choice because it was critical that we do some things differently, or frankly, we wouldn't be in business anymore. And organics did fit there. We were able to bring our farm from very low profit to high profit, which included organics fit for us because of reduced input costs as well as, in many cases, a premium price, which resulted in a better bottom line. I mean, our profits on a per acre basis, realizing that I need to step back a little bit. In transitioning our owned land, we were continuing to farm land on a conventional using the same procedures that our neighbors were using, because I had to prove to myself that in fact this system was more profitable, and it was. So over time we no longer farm conventionally because it's, in my view, less profitable, and so that's our personal experience on that. Of course, the other part of that is, whether it's organic or conventional, is we've chosen to use older equipment, very little new equipment. Diversity, I think, is key. We have livestock and crops. We may have a preference, as individuals to a certain type of farming, but certainly we have to adapt to what our environment is, to include the type of soils we have. We have rolling hills and areas of our farm, probably half of it, that would never be suitable for crop farming. So of course livestock's a perfect fit. And I guess I would also like to comment that, you know, there's this appearance thing. You know, we talk about young folks with peer pressure. We have that with us old guys as well. And that is that, you know, there's a perception that because of the things that we show, maybe it's a home, maybe it's equipment or pickups, that suggests success, but that might not always be the case.
Well, thanks, Dwayne. I'm going to pop ahead to this next slide here, and I know that you talked about record keeping and you try to prepay your loans, and you really ask some hard questions before you do capital purchases, such as do you need it and will it improve the bottom line. And I have just a couple final slides here from a visit to your farm. Again, you try and avoid the new paint disease, and there you see some of the equipment that you guys currently use, and it's not the newest and the shiniest. Down there on the right side, there's a photo of your first new tractor after 38 years of farming. So congratulations on that purchase. Well, I think we're going to try and wrap up here and maybe take some questions. I do have a slide here that's showing some of the resources that Dwayne has found valuable as he moves to organics. And you can access some of those, the Northern Plains Sustainable Ag Society. Again, some of the business management things that we mentioned. Dwayne's a student of holistic resource management and really enjoys the Stockman Grass Farmer, and also has enjoyed a book by Alan Nation titled Land, Livestock, and Life. So with that, I think we're going to turn it back over to Jeff. But Dwayne, thanks for joining us. And Dwayne and I are going to stay on the line while Jeff kind of helps us to wind down here.
Well, thank you, Susan and Dwayne, for the presentation. I think it's great to have this mix of big picture production issues that Susan, you presented, and then have Dwayne talking about the experiences he's had on the farm for the last 20 years. And we've got questions from our listeners that I think address both the big picture and specifics. So I'll throw out some of these questions to both of you and see what you think how you want to respond to those. Dwayne, one of the first questions we had to deal with the issue of the skeptics or the social issues and resistance from your neighbors. As you changed to organics, did you feel that you had to address some of the inertia in the community and other farmers kind of questioning what you were doing and had to kind of overcome some of that resistance just to try those things in your own neighborhood?
Actually, yes, thanks for the question. Actually, in my case, there was very little resistance, but I would have to say that in the front end, people were not aware of what we were doing. It wasn't like we went out and told everyone that we were going to switch to an organic system. So I'd have to say that in most cases, they were not aware of what we were doing. So that tells me that it wasn't very obvious to them that we had switched systems.
Good. What about when in weed control? Do you learn to accept that your farm will not look as clean and pristine as your neighbors, and that you just aren't as obsessive about them and know what really is worth treating rather than what you can live with?
Yes, there are some differences. I've always been concerned about weeds. Coming from a conventional system, I was aware of the tools, and we used them very readily and prided ourselves in I don't know that you'd say a weed-free farm. We've come to accept some things now that I would rather not. But as far as the economics of it, it's not that we have weeds that are actually causing economic hardship or anything like that. There are times of the year when there are some obvious things. That may well be a field of hard red spring wheat with some mustard blooming in it. May have very little impact to the soil or the production or the finances, but it is obvious for the period of time that the weed is blooming. So those are telltale signs of an organic farm.
Good. We talked some about managing insects in the storage of grain, but are there any issues we might talk about or share with our listeners about insect management in the field itself during the crop growing season? I'm thinking of wheat stem sawfly and issues that you might have seen in your own farms, or is it more just farm specific and it has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis?
I would say it's probably more case-by-case, but I would say that in most organic farms, and I'll specifically talk about ours, we've had very little problem with insects in field. I do believe that the diversity of the crops, frankly, there's just very little problem with insects.
Excellent.
Yeah, Jeff, I'll
Sorry.
address that too. With wheat stem sawfly, the biggest thing that we can do here where we have that problem is disease resistance, but also just having a diverse rotation really helps to break up those cycles. Another strategy I've heard of, I was able to talk with a farmer in Kansas who uses the refugia system, which is basically providing refuge for beneficial insects. He says that he's found that a lot of his neighbors spray their alfalfa for weevils. He doesn't spray his, but instead he puts out brush piles around his field. And his idea is that that's helping to provide a host place for beneficial insects, and he doesn't seem to find the same problems that his neighbors do. So there's some local strategies like that that you can use depending on your crop and your location.
Yes, Dwayne here, and I would certainly agree with that. We have tree rows on parts of our farm, not everywhere, and we have, waterways and things that we allow for the same thing. So I would agree with that.
Dwayne, you talked some about your mix of the 1,000 acres of organic grain and 3,000 acres of pasture. Are there any rules of thumb, or how did you come to that balance of profitability of livestock sales versus grain sales, and are there any rules of thumb there, or how did you come to that realization?
I don't think there's any rules of thumbs. Those were by choice. We were attempting to, again, minimize, or should I say, have the diversity reduce risk. I mean, our operation, frankly, is about reducing risk and profitability. And so the mix of livestock is not, some of it's by design to reduce risk and diversify our income, and of course it has to do with our land base. I mean, as I indicated earlier, we do have land that's not suitable for crop production, so livestock is just the right fit. So that's part of it. But the diversity, whether it be, in our case, of growing several different crops in rotation, as well as the livestock, we really feel that the diversity helps a lot on the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about livestock also, you mentioned using manure on the organic crops for your major source of fertilizer. What are some of the issues you have to deal with to ensure that that's an organic certified manure, or that you don't have any contamination there that can lose your organic certification?
Well, in our case, it's on-farm manure from our livestock, so there's very few, if any, issues there. I mean, there could be if we were applying some synthetics or feeding something that may cause a problem, but in our case, the source of the manure is key on an organic farm. If it was coming, say, from a neighbor, there may be a concern. We'd have to certainly see what the source of the manure is and possible contaminants, but in our case, it's not an issue.
So the pastures you're using, you ensure that they themselves are organic, and that the feed that the cattle are grazing on is organic in its basic nature as well?
No, not necessarily, because in our case we graze buffers and we graze some non-organic pasture that we rent or lease. So, but those are not issues because they could be. It's specific. Again, I would have to say that each case, as Susan indicated, depending on the situation, you would have to verify with your certification organization, whomever it is, to be certain that there were no restrictive products being used or prohibited products being used. So there's an individual case there. In our situation, they are not used, so it's not an issue. Our livestock are not organic. If the livestock was organic, then it would be a different issue from the standpoint of from the crops more so than the livestock side, because we are using buffers to our non-organic neighbors and things like that and feeding our livestock, but that has not been an issue on our organic cropland.
Okay, good. A question from a listener about a source of calcium, and they ask, is coral calcium a good source of calcium that is more quickly available than lime?
Dwayne here. I guess I can't answer that question because I have no experience and I'm not a agronomist, so I really can't answer that question.
Coral, like coral from the sea?
I think that's correct, yes.
Okay. I honestly don't know. I don't have any experience with that. My guess is that as long as it's, my guess is probably not, but I don't know. It's my final answer. I guess I need a lifeline on that question.
I had a question about the increase in labor costs, and it's kind of related both to peak oil and the increase we're seeing in costs for running machinery. And are we seeing one of the issues coming up more and more with organics is it might be that even though we know it's more intensive to use labor usually on organics, but the cost of machinery might be coming to that. Are we seeing more of an increase in labor costs and the use of labor, partly because of the increase in oil and gasoline, and that this might actually be another benefit of farming organically?
Oh, that's a big question.
I'm pondering it as well.
I'll let you address that first, Dwayne.
Well, I guess I'm pondering that as well. I would say that as far as machinery costs go, at least in my area, used tillage equipment is relatively cheap because of the trend toward no-till farming in the conventional side. So cost of equipment is not a major issue. In fact, it's better probably than it has been. We do have the real cost of diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is probably the largest input cost on our farm. So that can be a concern. Our operation is we do not do row crops or crops that require a lot of hand-type tillage or hand weeding type thing. We're growing mostly field crops that we're running farm equipment to do. So for us, I don't see that changing a lot.
I guess a couple of things that I could add to the discussion. I know there's some organic farmers who are now talking about adding oil seeds to their rotation specifically to power their farm. Bob Quinn up in Big Sandy estimates, I want to say like if he took 7 to 9% of his land and put it into an oil seed, he estimates he could power his farm with biodiesel that way. Another point that I've heard on the small grains as well is that you can farm a larger area with organic small grains than you can with organic row crops, and that's because there's no in-crop cultivation of the small grains. You can't get in there and do that. That would destroy the whole crop. Whereas with corn and soybeans, the row crops, you can get in there and cultivate, but there's more of a time-intensive nature to that compared with the small grains. So it's in talking with some farmers in Kansas, that's kind of their opinion, that they can do more with the small grain because they can use more land.
Now, I think I'll ask you both one last question on the future trends you see, and then I'll remind our listeners that we will be archiving this webinar on the ATRA website, and you can also feel free to call our ATRA hotline and get your questions answered by Susan directly in the future. But Dwayne and Susan, both of you, any final words you have on the trends you're seeing nationally or locally in organic small grains production and opportunities, and maybe just your final thoughts on organic small grain production and what we're seeing down the road here. So Dwayne, maybe any on your end to start with.
Okay, yes. I guess my observation is, and that's from the folks that we market our crops to, they are seeing, a trend upwards, not real large ones, but the trend is up in demand from the consumer. So that's what we're all about. The consumer purchases our product. And we are seeing it, there was a time when it was more, seen more, and of course we're middle country in North Dakota, but we're seeing it in our local grocery stores now, organic products. Pretty much any store you go into, they have a section, some cases small, some cases large, but there are organic products on grocery shelves in small town America. So I think that's a good sign.
Susan, your final thoughts?
Sure, and I'll just kind of briefly mention too that I put up another slide here of some further resources if people are interested, including that we're going to be developing, we're in the process of developing a series of organic small grains publications that should be coming out fairly soon. But trends that I see would be specialty crops. I know there's some talk in North Dakota with emmer wheat, which is an older type of wheat which is known in Italian cuisine as farro. Spelt and kamut are two grains that are good for folks who might have a gluten intolerance. So there's some specialty grains out there that are kind of gaining a foothold in the market. From what I see, questions that come across my desk, there's more questions out there now on local foods and how to mill those grains. So sometimes we'll get questions from people wanting to grow maybe just an acre of grain, and they're looking for smaller equipment, what grows in their area, how can they mill it, things like that. So that's going to be something that we're seeing more of. And also from an agronomic standpoint, I think really the future that we need to trend in organic small grains is adding some type of livestock component for fertility over the long term. I think that's going to be really key.
Well, thanks, Susan and Dwayne, both of you, for the presentation on organic small grains production. And I know in Montana, North Dakota, it's a very crispy, cool, well, frigid day here, below zero in Montana, and it's hard to think about crop production in the field right now, but it's great to have this time to think ahead to the season and present a lot of good information for our clients. Again, I'll remind people that the whole webinar we just presented is available online within a day or so on our ATTRA website, and you can see that on the website right there, attra.ncat.org. And you can also call our toll-free hotline, or there's an email there, smallgrains@ncat.org. And if you have questions you didn't have answered directly or have more technical questions, our technical staff, and most likely Susan Tallman herself, will be responding to those. So feel free to contact us more about this. And also, reminder, we'll be doing more webinars in the coming year through ATTRA, and we'll inform you through our normal channels about those. On behalf of the National Center for Appropriate Technology and the ATTRA program, this is Jeff Berkby thanking you for joining us, and join us again for future webinars down the road. Thank you.